is a man of many travels. He spent quite a life in multiple worlds. He spent some time in the depths of the Congo in Africa, only to find himself in France, where he met his wife, Ana Maria. To later come to Guatemala to be a U.S. citizen, to also represent so many communities around the world there at his Finca. So he covers a lot of ground. He is a Yale graduate and has spent quite a bit of time not only coming to understand, but serving others in the developed world. And I hope to take this opportunity tonight to kind of glean as much as you can from his personal story, advice, and anecdotes. Without further ado, please welcome.
Good night, everybody. It's nice to be among a group of students, many of whom are MBA students. 27 years ago, I got my MBA from the Yale School of Management, and I wonder how much of that I still remember. So it's good to see that it's still fresh with you, and that you're actually taking your spring break to work on some of those skills and not just unwind. And so let me begin this talk by simply explaining a little bit more of some of my own history and Maria's, just so you know a little more where we come from and how we got into this crazy activity we do now of trying to run a diversified coffee, banana, tourism, and other things farm. We were not farmers most of our lives. We got into this out of family circumstances. I was born in France of American parents who were in France doing reconstruction work after World War II. And I lived till I was 12 in French-speaking France and Switzerland. And so then my family moved to Chicago. And we lived there for about 6 years, and then I went to college at Oberlin College in Ohio. And I graduated in 1968. That was the height of the Vietnam War. Our generation was obsessed with the issues of war and peace, and the very real possibility that we could be killed in battle in Vietnam right after graduating from college. And many of us struggled with the issue of conscientious objection to war or alternatives to military service. And I was a conscientious objector to war, recognized by my government. My father, who was a minister, a Protestant minister, was also a conscientious objector to war during World War II, so that made it easier for me to make a credible case. And instead of going to Vietnam, I went to the Congo for 2 years as a volunteer, where I taught English in a local school, and lived in a village, and became very sensitized to the reality of poverty. I had not lived that close to poverty in my life, and so I decided to study developing countries and all the problems of international development, which is why I went to Paris. And I thought, I really loved Africa. I wanted to go back to Africa, but I wanted to study for a year problems of developing countries so that I could go back more intelligently and not repeat the same naive mistakes that you do as a volunteer. Little did I know that the first day of classes, I would end up sitting next to a woman from Guatemala, who is now here, and this is my wife, and we've been married. Ana Maria had studied social work, and we connected, and basically, I don't know what we studied about international development, but all I know is we got married, and we lived in Paris for 6 more years, and our 2 daughters were there, and I got involved in organizing international voluntary service organizations around the world, an NGO work. And then Ana Maria said, it's time to go home. And the question is, where is home? For her it's Guatemala, for me it's the US. And so we had to find some compromise. So we went to Peru. It was Latin America, but it wasn't her home, so we were both in a different country. And I began working and worked for 7 years with Church World Service, a non-governmental humanitarian organization linked to the National Council of Churches of the USA, representing 32 different denominations. In Peru, I added A's and O's to my French and learned to speak Spanish. And also had to administer a food aid program, Title II Food for Peace program, and became very critical of programs that hand out things to people and create dependency. And after I finished those 2 years, I was assigned to a lobby organization in Washington called Bread for the World that organizes voters in congressional districts to influence legislation to help overcome hunger in the U.S. and abroad. And I led a campaign to reform the Food for Peace program to make it more compatible with self-reliant development and less creating dependencies. It taught me how Washington works, how politics work, and we actually got a bill through Congress with bipartisan support, but with the teeth taken out of it in committee. And so I learned about politics. Then came a humanitarian emergency in Cambodia. We had Pol Pot's government was overthrown, and the Khmer Rouge were replaced by another socialist government supported by Vietnam that continues in power. And I ended up directing a year-long program in Cambodia with 6 organizations, and ended up also seeing how big bucks can be thrown around at humanitarian problems, and that often good intentions are not always translated into effective results. But it was an interesting experience. And then we ended up saying, you know, we need to really come back to Latin America. And so we went to Central America, where we worked with all the countries of Central America with Church World Service, and a lot of people who were victims of the dictatorships and the civil wars going on. I'm talking now 1981 to 83. And so we were exposed to a lot of the problems of people trying to do the work for social justice, and in an environment where the military was cracking down on peasant communities, and a lot of our friends and colleagues ended up as refugees in our house. So we had a whole other dynamic. By then I'd been already 7 years in one organization and felt a need to have these organizations managed better. Non-governmental, non-profit organizations are full of good intentions, but sometimes they just botch things up. And so I decided I needed to study and get an MBA. And so that's why I ended up taking 2 years to study. And then after that, I could have gone to Wall Street or done all the things that MBAs do, but I just had NGOs in my blood. And I just had a need to go back to the kind of work I did before. So I worked at Save the Children for 10 years as Deputy Coordinator for Latin America. And then Christian Children's Fund, another 5 years doing their international grants. And then finally, a couple of years I actually worked for the government, with the USAID's Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance in coordinating U.S. humanitarian aid in Latin America. So that's kind of the professional background that I had when suddenly Ana Maria's father died, and the family farm that he had been managing for 30 years was not being taken care of. Her brother lived in Germany, her sister in the capital, and we were in Costa Rica, and the local manager of the farm was robbing the place, asking the mother to pay all the bills but keeping the profits. And so Ana Maria went to visit her mother and realized there's a problem here, and that they couldn't be fixed with occasional trips from Costa Rica. So we left all that humanitarian work baggage and he came to try to help manage the family business with no agricultural experience. And we came in 2001, and we were welcomed by a crash in coffee prices. The coffee prices tumbled in 2002 to their lowest level in 50 years, for reasons I will now explain. And now we've struggled over the last few years to survive with low coffee prices, and only in the last 2 years coffee prices have come back up, and we're now smiling and happy to be coffee farmers. But it's been a struggle. It's been a struggle. And we've had to do many things besides grow coffee just to survive economically. And so I guess the theme of what I'm going to talk about now is how to preserve jobs and diversify income in a Guatemalan family coffee farm. Coffee as an industry is big business. It's second only to oil in the dollar value of the exports in world trade. There's more than 20 million people who work in coffee. And it's a big employer, especially in third world countries. The coffee is also, for Guatemala, a very important part of the history. It was the main export for many years. But Guatemala, which produces some of the best coffee in the world, is a very small producer, only about 3.5% of the world's coffee. The biggest coffee producing country is Brazil. Brazil produces 35 to 40% of the world's coffee. The second largest producing coffee is Vietnam, now 12 to 15%. And then comes Indonesia, India, Ethiopia, Colombia, and Guatemala is about 7 to 8. So we are, as a country, part of a big commodity industry. Guatemala has now diversified, and coffee is no longer the #1 product. There's other tourism that surpass coffee as a source of income. But anyway, that big business, we were a small part of it. And what happened is that the prices of coffee used to be very stable, especially from 1965 to 1980, when there was an international coffee agreement. Like OPEC it was for oil, there was an international coffee organization that managed supply and set quotas for each country, and so that by managing supply, the prices didn't fluctuate much. But in the 1970s, public opinion turned against all cartels, especially because of the abuses of OPEC, which raised oil prices to sky-high levels and caused worldwide inflation that led to changes in government. And in the U.S., the fall of the Jimmy Carter presidency, who was replaced by Ronald Reagan, and in came a more Republican government with an ideology of free trade and against any manipulation of the markets. And the U.S., which was the world's largest coffee consuming country, pulled out of the International Coffee Agreement. And that collapsed, basically. And coffee began to be traded on the stock exchanges of New York for Arabica coffee and London for Robusta coffee, 2 types of coffee. And as coffee became a commodity that was traded by, and speculators got into to see how much profit they could make buying cheap and selling dear, the prices started fluctuating even more. And many coffee growers simply found it difficult to make serious plans of how you could count on enough income to cover your costs, because you never knew what you were going to get for your crop. And so in the year 2002, another thing hit the markets. Vietnam, which had not been a coffee producing country, until then, suddenly and dumped its first big harvest on the world market. And many of the companies that bought and roasted coffee started buying cheaper Vietnam coffee instead of our coffee. And so the Vietnamese coffee, which was actually cheap because they did not have hard currency, they could sell for a very few dollars, and that meant a lot of purchasing power in their local socialist economy. They were able to sell bad quality Robusta coffee at a much lower price than Arabica coffee, the better quality coffee, which we and others in Central America produce. And at that time, 5 big transnationals that roasted 80% of the world's coffee started buying a lot of cheap Robusta coffee from Brazil and Vietnam and mixing it with a little Arabica coffee to improve the taste. And the quality of supermarket coffee went downhill. And a new movement arose, which is the specialty coffee movement of people who wanted to taste really good coffee. Starbucks is the best example and leading company in this trend, namely produce coffee that is the best quality you can, and that developed a whole new market in the US that was growing at 15% per year, while supermarket coffee blends that involved a lot of this cheaper Vietnamese and Brazilian coffee were down at 3.5% growth per year or less. So this specialty coffee segment of the market was growing fast, and along comes Guatemala now, which produces some of the best coffee in the world, which was well positioned to feed into the specialty market because of the quality of the coffee. But there's an altitude difference. Gourmet quality coffee is generally grown over 2,500 feet altitude. That's over 800 meters altitude. Below that altitude, you tend to produce ordinary coffee that is not good enough to be sold as quality coffee, specialty coffee. And so many coffee farms in the lower altitudes of Guatemala had to get out of coffee because they couldn't produce for the better paying gourmet sector. Our farm is at 750 meters altitude, and we're right below the 800 level, but because we grow shade-grown coffee and do many good things that produce the best quality that we can for our altitude, our coffee has been cupped consistently as equivalent to 1,000 meters or more, a higher quality coffee. So what strategy did we adopt at the time? There were 2 strategies available for coffee farms: specialize or diversify. Specialize meant produce gourmet coffee, do it the best job. Diversify is little by little, as your coffee plants become old, replace that with other more profitable crops or activities. And so many of the lower altitude farms got out of coffee and went into sugarcane, rubber, cattle, and real estate development. Around us, five coffee farms are now dairy farms. But here we are still growing coffee. Why? We basically chose both strategies. We couldn't make up our mind. We've been for 3 generations a coffee growing family. I think I didn't mention that. Ana Maria's grandfather bought the farm in 1936, ran it for 30 years, passed it to 5 of his children. Ana Maria's father was the manager of the farm, and he ran it for 30 years and ended up buying the other shares. And then when he died, he passed it to his 3 children. And so we're the 3rd generation running that farm. It's always been a coffee farm. It's very difficult to get out of coffee. It's not like corn and soybeans. This is a perennial crop. The plant lasts 15 years. And so we continue to do coffee. But we did it better. And now we're doing very well. But we also diversified because the price being paid for coffee was too low. And so we got into bananas, which were already growing in the coffee plantation as part of the shade. We simply added value to the bananas. When you take bananas and you harvest them green and sell them to the local pickup truck buyers, they will pay you 15 quetzales for one rack of bananas that has about 90 to 100 bananas. 15 quetzales is $2. When you sun-dry the bananas, as we eventually did, they're worth 8 times more. And so we thought by adding value to the bananas, we'd be able to make it work. The problem is, the world is not clamoring for its daily ration of sun-dried bananas. It's something that was popular 40 years ago in Guatemala, you know, you've tasted it. It's pretty good, but it's not something that you're going to necessarily all of a sudden decide to buy every day and eat like, or drink like a cup of coffee. So we got into adding value to a product, but it was a product for which we had to create a market, and that's very difficult. It's much easier to produce for a market that exists than to produce something nifty that doesn't have a demand. The other thing we got into was tourism, and it just happened by circumstance. The house we were living in was old. It had termites, and we started removing the termite-infested boards and ended up gutting the whole second floor of the house and rebuilding it and changed the rooms a bit to make them a little more logical and open broader windows, and it ended up a pretty nice house. Those who stay there know it. And some friends of ours who brought foreign visitors to the country started asking, hey, can we come and visit your farm? And we said, sure, why not? And it got to be a habit, and we started charging for the service. It started with church delegations who were coming on 10-day mission trips, who wanted a day off doing something different. And they would come for a meal and a tour. And then we got into university students who spent 10 days, 10 students doing manual labor on the farm for about 8 semesters. We had groups from a program in Costa Rica that came. And at first it was just identifying with the coffee farmers and learning how the life of a coffee plantation worker is. But it then became more of a focused on the international business students who ended up using our farm as a practicum for analysis of specific problems. And we've had many generations of students studying how do you do tourism on a coffee farm? How do you diversify crops? How do you market these sun-dried bananas? How do you manage personnel in a farm of this kind? And so they've done little mini studies. We had Guatemalan university students who produced a whole thesis on how to export these things to Siloam Springs, Arkansas, of all places. John Brown University got involved in that too. And French students who never even came to the French MBA students from Grenoble, one of the top management schools in France, as a result of some French tourists, did a thesis on how to introduce these bananas into the ski resort area of Grenoble, France. And so we had a 68-page thesis done by 10 students we'd never met, and we only saw ourselves briefly on Skype and exchanged emails, and they did a thesis on that. They've done very good work, and so we generated a whole lot of information. But the problem still is, you know, we're biting off more than we can chew. Who's going to do all the follow-up? You know, students can do nice things, but some other people who stay permanently on the job have to make things happen. Other products we've had are wood products. 97% of the coffee in Guatemala is shade grown. And so the trees have a life cycle of their own, and when they get old, you cut them. And you sell the trunk as boards and the branches as firewood. And about 12% of our income comes from trees. 50% comes from coffee, 25% from bananas, 12% from trees, maybe 6 to 8% from tourism, and honey. We have honeybees, and they help pollinate the other crops. But we didn't know when we started packing that honey into little jars that the stuff crystallizes if you don't, after a while. And so, people in Guatemala see a jar with crystallized honey and they'll say, somebody has adulterated it with sugar, when in fact that's the natural thing that happens to honey. So marketing a product that people are not sure about is a problem. And then the other thing, I think, another thing that challenge that we found is that traditionally coffee farms pay low wages. And there's a lot of pressure to keep those wages low. 70% of the cost of a coffee farm is personnel. And one of the competitive advantages of Guatemala over the years has been that they could produce coffee here with extremely high reliance on manual labor, when manual labor was not very expensive. But manual labor gets more expensive year by year. When we came in 2001, the farm was paying, I think, 25 quetzales a day to the men workers and about 17.5 quetzales a day to women. Within a week of our arrival, labor inspectors came and told us that we were paying below the minimum wage, and that we were paying 21 quetzales, and the minimum wage had gone up to 25. And so we needed to comply with the law. And Ana Maria and I, full of idealism from our earlier realities, said, okay, we want to be legal, let's do it. Let's just raise the wages. Huh? And so we made equal pay for equal work. All the women got the same, the men the same, the legally required things. Everything was, for 6 months, legal. And then a populist government of Portillo was elected, and within a 4-year period, the minimum wage went up 47%. Just as coffee hit the lowest price in 50 years. And there was just no way we could sustain and comply with the legally required minimum wage increases. So we, like every other coffee farm in the country, simply did not comply. And one thing we learned is, nobody else complies, so why should we? And so we basically tried to do, with every increase decreed by the government, we increased by a similar percentage from where we were, but never quite reached the level because we just couldn't make the enterprise cover its costs and comply with the requirement. And so that's an ethical issue that we had to deal with. How do you stay in business and also comply with minimum wage? We found that if you're not in business, you don't offer any employment. And for the workers, they would rather earn a bit less than minimum wage and be employed than not have anything. And so even this week, Ana Maria and I need to decide if this Friday's pay we're going to raise the wages as we should this year, and by how much. It's a big question. The other question is, how do you manage a family business, which is different than a corporation? Many of you who are MBA students may end up getting a corporate job with salary and everything pretty much defined. In a family business, the rules are set by you. You and not everyone in the family really cares that much to get involved in the nitty-gritty. So you don't have to ask, what's the policy here, so that you can comply. You set the policy. And sometimes you can make expensive mistakes. The other thing is learning. How many mistakes are you going to make before you do that, get it right, you know. Very often, coffee farms are run pretty much the way they've always been run. The operating staff know pretty much what needs to be done, and you just say, amen, go ahead, tell me how much you're going to spend, and we'll spend. And the discipline of planning and of evaluating what is really profitable and what isn't, and where should you focus on, is something we've had to do. We got involved in many different projects, and now we need to focus more. So these are some of the questions we're dealing with. Maybe the others can come out in a question and answer period rather than my going on and on. It gives you a little flavor of where we are. Our tourism, I forgot to mention, is now mainly French, because Ana Maria and I are French speakers, and a tour agency has adopted us as a required stop on the circuit of their French tourists who spend a month in Guatemala, and they generally spend a night in the Finca, and then they get a coffee, they go hike around our volcano views and river views, and then get an agricultural tour. And the formula works real well, and Ana Maria has set cooking standards that are hard to beat. And so for French people who live to eat rather than eat to live, we seem to have met their demand to the point that now the big question for us is, when is enough? After all, the tourists stay in our house. When they come, we're sharing bathrooms. They're next to us. They're eating our meals together. We can't have a life of our own. Ana Maria rightly tells me, "Hey, I want to build another house. Let's build a bamboo house somewhere here where I can live and I can do my own thing, and tourists can come and occupy the big house, but we don't need to have our life constantly at the service of tourists." And so we've actually had to turn down groups of tourists that want to come. And so, it's many other farms would kill to get the amount of tourists that we get. But we've just kind of been, we realize sometimes you get into a line of business that has a momentum of its own, and you got to decide, can you run with it or not? And if you're not going to run at the pace that the business requires, then can you still do it at a slower pace, or should you just find a different way? Can you hire people to do it? More people to do it, and stop running it yourself? Well, that's the problem when it's French speakers. How many French speakers can we hire in San Felipe Retarhueo who can take care of tourists and explain to them the local context with references to their own culture? We're it. And so sometimes the challenge is, how can you take a successful venture and staff it up the right way so that it'll happen? One of the many groups that Dimitri has brought came up with a brilliant idea that we should have a whole bunch of MBA interns come to the farm and run the place. And that way we can just retire and be sort of idea people and not hands-on people, and that way maybe we can do it. But the more we look at the experience of short-term people coming in and messing things up, we realize that no, you need stable people who are going to have a long-term stake in the place and not have the place run by short-term outsiders. So these are questions we have. And I guess lastly, for how long do we want to do this? Succession planning in the family business. I wish I took that course at Yale. It was offered and I never did. I never thought, it never occurred to me I'd be in a family business. Some of you come from families that have a business. Don't put blinders on. You're the next people to run the business, whether you want to or not. I mean, Ana Maria and I knew her father had a coffee farm, but that was his business. The idea that we would be called upon to do that didn't occur to us. And now, we're in our mid-60s and at an age when many people think of retiring. But farming is a life sentence, and all of our kids of the three owners live in other countries than Guatemala. And none of them are interested in farming. And so, how do we manage the next step of the farm? Are we going to just keep on keeping on until we're just so tired that we give up or get sick? Or are we going to sell the farm while it's valuable and see who might want to do it? Or are we going to maybe set up a different company to run the farm while maintaining ownership of the land and the buildings? What are the models that, of corporate ownership and management of a small business that are most appropriate for us? So those are things that are not just a Guatemalan reality, but it's also something culturally in this country. People don't talk about mortality and succession planning. Basically, after somebody dies without a will and everybody gets in trouble and the families start fighting each other, then you talk about it, generally in murmured conversations behind people's backs. But the idea of being upfront and dealing with the realities that are only human, of businesses have a succession agenda that needs to be addressed early on before they lose their value. This is an issue we're working on now. I think I've given you enough tidbits of information, and I'd like to perhaps stop my comments now and allow questions, and maybe if there's some particular things you want to be interested in. Those who are working on coffee particularly may have a lot of questions about coffee, and we can maybe get together after the larger group if you want to go in greater depth about coffee. Will be available to you. But I'm thinking more